Well, we had family dinners every Sunday, Brian, and this was a tradition that Grandma Wright insisted that everybody gather around the table. We had big family dinners. Everybody brought some potluck, and it was tradition that the men always ate first, and the women and the girls ate what was left over. And the kids, the male children, depending on how old they were, either sat with the mothers, or if they finally decided that they were big enough and there were enough seats at the table, the male children were allowed to eat at the table with the fathers. It was really a chauvinistic type of meal. The women got to cook it, they put it on the table, they ate last, and they cleaned it all up while the men sat around and talked about crops or whatever they wanted to talk about, politics.
And Uncle Paul there always ate with the men and turned around and sometimes would come back and eat with the women. he would do this. Yes. But Phyllis really, like Mom cooked all the food. It really wasn't potluck. Each one, Grandma cooked all the food when she had it.
Well, Mother always brought a cake.
Not for this.
Mother baked cakes for most of the things.
Oh, that was family picnics in the summertime. Yeah. But when we had these family get-togethers, Mom cooked all the food, and so did Grandma, and so did Aunt Ethel, so did Aunt Pearl, and so did Aunt Gladys. Whenever they did it, you know, I mean, whenever you had them, you cooked everything. You had like pie, cake,
canned fruit,
and everything. You had
chicken, beef, several different vegetables.
Yes.
Fresh bread,
right.
Homemade.
Right.
It took all week to get ready for it. You cooked and you cleaned. This is when we brought out the damask tablecloth that went on the table in the dining room where the men ate. The women didn't always get to use it. They often ate in the kitchen. Women were really second class in these family dinners. But the food was spectacular.
Used the wood range,
yes,
wood to
heat the stove.
And then trying to wash the dishes without sinks, because none of these houses had plumbing, and we would have big dish pans, and you would wash up all of the best china and the cups and saucers, and it took the women and the girls all of the rest of the afternoon to clean up the dishes and put them away. And you can imagine trying to wash dishes for 20 to 21 people, and all of the pots and pans that it took to cook all of this food, because it was like having 3 full menus or more that people got to choose from.
Well, and the stoves had a big reservoir.
Right.
That had the water in. And what would that have held? 10, 15 gallon of water?
About 10 gallon.
And that would be hot water that we used to wash the dishes with, plus you'd have a tea kettle of water to scald it to rinse them with.
Right.
But that's the source of water we had to use, hot water to do the dishes with. But it was done in a big gray dish pan that would have held about, Mother had a big gray round dish pan that would have held about 3 gallons of water, don't you suppose?
I imagine.
And
you could put a dozen plates in at a time.
Right.
And cups and saucers. And Grandma Wright was one who it was a matriarchy in a way. Grandpa thought he ran the family, and he was the one who knew all about the politics and all about the planting and all of the business aspects, but it was Grandma who ran the family, and she knew when all the babies were coming, and when all of the people in town that had to get married and wanted to get married, or what the arrangement was, and she kept track of all of the grandchildren and all of the marriages and all of the romances in the family with these Sunday dinners. This is how she kept control of the family, was to have us all there and know what was going on with all of the kids. And then all of the grandchildren would be compared to each other. If you remember, I was always compared to Cousin Wava and Cousin Joyce, and how Grandma would give her approval on whether she thought we were healthy enough looking or not, which ones were growing better than the others. Marge was always compared to Cousin Helen. Burm was always compared to Cousin Kenny.
But Burman and I were both about 2 notches below Helen or Kenny.
Yes, and Cousin Helen always got to cut the candy bars in half. Grandpa would often go to town and bring us Milky Ways, or Three Musketeers, and Helen always got to cut them, and she always divided them and always took her piece first. We always thought that was kind of mean. She always got a generous serving.
Well, and sometimes we'd have a sack of candy, of mixed candy, and she'd count out all the pieces. If there's any left over, well, then she got the extra.
We weren't always fond of Cousin Helen. And then Cousin Deloma and Merlin and Joyce were held about in slightly less esteem than we were.
Right.
And I always had a tendency to feel a little bit sorry for them because we didn't like the fact that Helen and Kenny were held in higher esteem than we were, when we knew that we were the best. There was no question in our minds but what Marge and Flo and Burm and Phil were the best. Right?
Right.
We were the right stuff.
This was just Grandpa and Grandma Wright's family. It'd be Grandma would have them one Sunday, Aunt Pearl and Uncle Paul would have them one Sunday, Mom and Dad would have them one Sunday, Aunt Ethel and Uncle Ellis Grindle would have them, because Aunt Ethel was the only sister of Dad, see. And then Clark and Aunt Gladys would have it. We just rotated from one Sunday. Every Sunday went to somebody's house. And when we left the last gathering, well, they'd say who was going to have the next one, you know. And we would, kids get together and play, and the men would visit and the women would cook. I guess you say they worked all day because they cooked and cleaned up and they visited some, of course. But it was just a family get-together. But we had food, all kinds of food. We would have usually chicken and beef and mashed potatoes and gravy and vegetables, probably several vegetables, pie, maybe 3 or 4 pies, a cake, lots of food. But Grandma Wright's thing that she always made was sauerkraut and wieners. We could always knew Grandma would have sauerkraut and wieners. And Grandma Wright, one of the things she used to like to cook in the fall was apple butter. And she would cook it on the back of the range where it had to be cooked slowly. And she would have that sitting there maybe for 2 or 3 days until it would get to be thick as butter. You know, she would start out with a thinner applesauce, and she used cinnamon and probably allspice and nutmeg, you know, and a little brown sugar. And you just cook that down until it's thick and then use it like a jelly. It would serve the same purpose as jelly or jam.
Well, I just cooked dinner for them.
Yes, but tell them what all you cook.
Well,
Oh, she had just regular meals. Chicken, beef, pie, cake. They prepare for it 2 or 3 days ahead of time.
Mashed potatoes, gravy,
yeah,
noodles.
that's why I look like I do now.
I think the highlight of the Depression times was it was the main part of our social life was going to town on Saturday night, and we kids would stand outside on Saturdays when rains would be coming over the hills from Nebraska, and we would stand out and say, rain, rain, go away, come back again another day, because we wanted to go to town so badly that evening. And it hasn't been until late years that our dad told us that we were the ones saying, rain, rain, go away, but he was the one who felt it most in his heart, because going to town on Saturday night was their entire social life, and he wanted to go to town worse than we did. And at that time, my folks had a very good-looking car. It was a 1929 Whippet, which they brought new, and it was a beautiful thing, tan with a nice red striping. But the only trouble was that the Whippet didn't run too regularly, and the place where we lived had a big sloping driveway, and Father would get the car rolled out of the garage and coast down the driveway, and if it got started, by the time it came to the house, we all went to town. But if not, he coasted on down the road and try to start it then. If it didn't start, then Mother and we kids would all get out and help push the thing back up and then start all over again. I know there was one hill in our little town of Thurman, which we would always park on this hill. And when it came time to go home, we were always the last people to leave. The Wrights would all get in their car and coast down the hill, and if the car had not started, then Mother and we 4 kids would get out and push until it started. But we always made it to town, and we always made it home all right.
How did you come to having a car before everybody had a car?
Well, I don't know.
Well, a lot of them
Were
had
you
cars
coming into
before we
more-
did. But
Did you come into more money, or do you have somebody who had a car and sold it to you, or what?
Well, didn't have to have much money. The first junk car we bought cost $35, I think.
Car with us. Yes, we had this beautiful car.
It was
tan with black and red stripes, a 1929 new one. And we pushed that down the driveway, down the little grade toward the mailbox,
It was the only
back up
car I
and back
knew
down again.
that ran on people power.
Right. And it wouldn't start until we pushed it up and down and back, and eventually it would start.
It was only used on Saturday night,
Right.
and the battery would run down or something. I don't know why it would never
Just would
turn over.
run.
And Dad would sit at the controls, and Mother and the four of us kids pushed this car up and down this road, and then the car would kick off, and we'd all run after the car and jump in to go
Well,
to town.
And we always managed to get to town in time to get on this little grade so that we would have a downhill grade so we could push it down the hill to start it so we could go home, too. You remember that?
It only went out of the garage on Saturday night.
And Sunday for the Sunday dinner.
Oh, that's right.
To
Sunday.
go to our
Well,
family
I don't recall it. We had to push it on Sunday, though, after we'd driven it on
I
Saturday.
don't remember that either.
It was Saturday night that we always pushed it.
Always pushed the car. But Dad had a choice. He could have gotten a 29 Chevrolet or a 29 Whippet, wasn't it, Carl?
Yes.
And I think they fell in love with the beautiful exterior of the car.
And
they
then
bought
nice
it,
upholstery, too.
yes, and had they bought the 1929 Chevrolet, probably they would have had a car that we would never had to push.
Right.
But it didn't work that way.
Well, Mother always thought it was her job to keep the car immaculate.
She did.
And it was always washed and scrubbed, and this was one of our jobs, was to help polish
Almost
up the
every
car.
Saturday it was cleaned.
And they had a device that I've never seen any other place before. Do you remember the thing we pumped the water with?
Yeah, that's
It
right.
sat over the side of the wash tub, and you held it with one foot, and you pumped up and down like you did a tire pump, and it would spray this little weak spray of water over the car. But we used this religiously to
Right.
wash that car.
Right.
And it would be an antique now. I have no idea what ever happened to it.
I've never seen another one since when you think about it.
And then the other thing, it was rather grand about this beautiful car. Remember in the summertime, Dad had this set of little silk flags
Right.
on a ring that would sit around the radiator cap, and it just looked so elegant on this car to go down the road with the little flags flying in the breeze. And then Mother sat in her seat, and Dad sat in the driver's seat, and we four kids sat in the back seat. And this was fine. But then we had the argument over who got the window, and we had to sit on it so that two sat up on the seat on the edge and two sat back so that we'd all fit into the car.
Right, and I remember if you rode by the window as you went to someplace, then you automatically rode in the center.
when
And
you
the people
came in.
that rid in the center took the outside to come home.
Right.
They had the view to come home.
And then it would be so cold. This car had no heater, as I recall, in the wintertime. And we didn't go to Shenandoah very often, but we would go before Christmas. And I think it was still this car. Maybe it was the 32 Chevy or something
About
that
the
we had
32
later.
Chevy when we went to Shenandoah, I'm sure.
But we had the old horse robe
Yes.
that we kids would sit in there, one up, one back, one up, one back, alternating as we sat there so that all of our bottoms would fit on this little bench, this seat. And we'd have this heavy, coarse, scratchy horse robe over our laps.
Right, it was wool. It was warm.
And then we'd still be freezing. Our feet would be
Our
so
feet
cold.
would be freezing.
Yeah.
As far as our legs would
No, it was
we
just
were
the feet.
warm. Just
It was
the feet.
would be.
First we had was an old Model T, an old car that had been junked, and we got it, restored it a little bit, and got a license for it. We had 2 or 3 Model Ts, I guess. 2 or 3 years we didn't have any.
Well, can you tell them about the new car you bought?
Well, the first one was a Whippet. We searched the state over, we couldn't have got a worse one.
Can you tell him about pushing the car, Mom?
Push
Tell
it.
Brian how we pushed the car.
We used to push the board and we rode it.
Well, he would like to know some of the episodes of pushing the car.
Well, we get in the back and push it and push it and push it. So-
Down the driveway, down the road, back up past the mailbox, back up, we push it back up the grade, push it back down again.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
She claims she pushed it more than she rode on it.
I think she's right.
Sister Florine was organized from the time that she was born and has always been an organized person, and she was very frugal and very conservative, took extremely good care of everything that she had. And one time during the Depression years, Mother's oldest sister, Aunt Maud, came to visit, and rest her soul in peace, Aunt Maud was a battle axe that none of us cared for, but she came, and on this particular occasion she had a gift for each of us children. She had 5 dimes, which to us 5 dimes was the size of 5 wagon wheels would be today. And I, in particular, was so proud of my newly found wealth that I went out into the outhouse to count my money, and unfortunately I lost 20% of my money, fell down the outhouse hole and was gone already. But Marjorie and I went to town to the old Warner's store and spent all our money in one evening, and Flo held on to hers. The folks were so disgusted that we spent our money for Kiss O Love shampoo and Wave Sad, and we had wasted the money, and Flo still had hers, but the stuff lasted a long time. Marge would just do her hair, and then she'd fix me all up, and it lasted long after Flo's 50 cents was spent, so we felt that we didn't do too badly. We used to go to Thurman on Saturday night, as I said earlier, and the thing that you did in Thurman is you walked round and around the two-block business district with your friends. If you were fortunate enough that you had the money, you would go to the old Portel Theater, which wasn't too bad for our little town of Thurman. It was of course there was no air conditioning, and it was a regular hothouse, but no one really cared. It was quite a change of pace to get to go to a movie, and we didn't get to go often, but every so often on Sunday night, the folks would have enough money to take us to the Issus Theater in the town of Tabor, and we would go see the movies. I've long ago forgotten what particular set of movies there was that we went to, that the folks particularly enjoyed, and we kids were delighted to get to go.
And then Grandma Wright wasn't the best cook, but she made a fudge that most of us didn't think was too great. She made this every time you come. You know, I mean, if you came of an evening, why, she maybe had just made it, or if you came and she didn't have it, she'd go hurry up and stir up a pan of fudge. And it was never fudge consistency of what we think of as fudge today. It was sort of a taffy-like fudge. Never set up like fudge. When you cut it with a knife, it was a little bit stringy or sort of like taffy. But yet it had a good flavor. And all of us have missed it, and none of us know how she did it. So we don't know how to make it. So we've lost that recipe. But it was good. And then when we were kids, Grandma used to take us, and when we wanted a snack in the afternoon, she would get out an assortment of saucers and get some spoons and go to the brown sugar can and give us all probably a quarter to half a cup of brown sugar just that neat, which wasn't good for us, but we looked for it as a treat.
Basically on the money that the eggs and the cream brought in, Mother would have 12 dozen cases of eggs to take to town every Saturday night, which would be more than enough for groceries, and there was always a little cash left over for us. We children were fortunate enough that we received an allowance. I think we received 3 cents a week, and back when they had the penny candies in the local stores, and you can't imagine how much fun you can have spending 3 cents, because you could get enough candy to last for a whole week. We used to buy one particular item called BB Bats, which were a elongated square on a stick that were about 3 inches long and an inch across and a half-inch thick, and it would be 3 days eating on each one, and we could get those in vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry, and if I remember correctly, they came 2 for 1 cent, so we had plenty to last us.
Our 5 cents, we used to get maybe a penny or two a week, for groceries. But I remember when we reached the great altitude of 5 cents a week for our treats, we would go and buy BB Bat candy bars
Right.
and penny items. Maybe we'd get 5 things, but Flo was the Scotch one. Burman and I was the ones that our candy probably lasted us till Wednesday, but Flo would manage to still have some on Friday.
Right.
She'd make hers last, and we'd take a butcher knife and cut off a 1/2 inch of a BB batch, you know, so that we would maybe get several days out of 1 cent candy, a lollipop, you know.
Well, of course, the BB Bat was a particular kind of candy that no one has ever invented since. It was a hard candy that you broke off of this stick, and it was what, like 3 inches long?
Yes.
And for a penny, and you could chop it off, and then you tried to chew it, and it was tough as the dickens.
A little off the taffy order.
Right.
In flavor,
Like
I think.
very hard taffy, and it took a while to soften it up. So you really could make the BB Bat last for most of the week.
Right.
And there was some kind of candy-like gum I remember getting, several sticks to a package for a penny. And then there were some things that sort of forerunners of the Lifesaver that were a hard candy in a little roll that you would get, maybe 4 or 5 in a roll for a penny. But we each had different favorites. But
Right.
Flo always had hers all week.
Flo lasted longer. Well, and I can remember another occasion. Dad lost the hub off of a cultivator, wasn't it?
2-row.
2-row cultivator. And so he told us if we would go out to the field and help him if we would find this hubcap, he would give us a dime apiece. That was all 4 of us. We had 40 cents at stake. So we found the hubcap. Burman and I went to E.L. Warner's store. I bought 10 cents worth of talcum powder, and Burm bought 10 cents worth of Kissel Love wave set.
He had the wave set.
And we would, of course, we blew it, you know. We knew we'd blew it, but boy, we'd get upstairs and he'd slick down his hair, and I would powder up with a Kissel Love talcum powder. We had a ball.
What did Flo do with her? She saved
She
it. didn't
saved her.
But you still had 10 cents a year later.
She probably had 10 cents a year later, but Burma and I squandered ours the first Saturday.
Now, the wave set is something that you had to see to believe, because it was a green gel, like in a jar, and you dip your comb down into it and then run it through your hair and let it dry, and your hair would be stiff as a board. But Grandma Wright used it, and then she'd comb the wave set through her hair, and then she would take her hands and press waves in her hair along the side, and each side, and a lot of women did this.
Oh,
Aunt Florence and
Aunt Mildred did too.
Used
right. A lot of people.
But usually boys didn't have wave set on their hair.
Oh,
only Burm.
well, Burma and I didn't know any better. We went into this
But
store.
Burm had wavy hair. Well, no, he didn't at that time, did he? He didn't get curly hair till later.
This was kind of an old store that had all this merchandise they couldn't sell, more or less. And I suppose we went in there looking around, and I would imagine he probably suggested to us what we could spend the dime for so he could get the dime.
Well, that was a store, as I recall. They were elderly people,
Yes.
as I remember them, and the store had been old, and the stock was old. And it was probably lighted by 260-watt bulbs.
Not too much.
But it would be open on Saturday night.
Right.
And it was one that didn't do a lot of business, but once in a while, the color of thread you needed, or the pair of stockings you needed, would be at Warner's store.
Right.
Usually everything was at Axtell's store.
Probably in the 30s, they had a sale. And they sold merchandise that probably was 1910 vintage. I remember them selling the pointed toe shoes and things like this, probably for 25 cents a pair or something, you know. And Mother and Dad bought, we girls, Florian and I particularly, I don't know about you, we got a pair of those shoes to wear in the summertime, and the first thing I did was went out to the grain bin with those shoes and killed a mouse with a pointed toe shoe. And we were given, from 3, so we probably started out about 3 pennies, up when we graduated up to 5 pennies to have to spend for candy, and we bought penny conglomerate candy. Sometimes we get 2 or 3 items for a penny. Sometimes we got like a BB bat, and then it was probably about 3 or 3.5 inches long, and we could take a knife and cut that off in little 1/2-inch blocks, and we made this 3 to 5 cents worth of candy last us all week. And Burman and I, sometimes ours only lasted maybe 3 days, where Florine's always lasted till Friday. She could get 6 days off of hers, but Burman and I could do usually about 3 or 4 days if we really saved. We just didn't save that well. We just wanted to enjoy ours and then mooched off of her if we could, but we didn't get much off of Flo because she didn't really give us a lot. And then another thing I remember, in probably the Depression times, Phyllis got a little small child's baking set, and it had a tiny little cookbook that were proportions to the pans that went with the baking set, and she would make nut bread. And this little pan was about 3 inches long and about 1.5 inches wide, and Burman and I would stand there and get her to slice us off a little slice of nut bread so we could have our nut bread. So that's one thing I remember that we received at Christmas time. And I remember probably must have been about 33. Florine was very sick. She had a vertebrae out of place in the back of her neck. And she was very sick at Christmas time, and so we were anticipating Santa Claus coming, and about midnight we came downstairs, and we thought maybe Santa Claus had come, and he hadn't. And Dad said he thought if we would go back to bed, he thought he'd been outside and he could hear Santa Claus's sleigh bells up about Thurman. So we went to sleep dreaming of Christmas and got up and Santa Claus had made his arrival. But Florine was very sick, and then we had taken her, choir practice what brought it around and saved her, because they were going to take her to Omaha and operate on her, and had they have done this, she probably never would have been just right. And the osteopath, or the chiropractor, with the treatment, relieved the pressure, and then she was all right because her eyes had crossed and everything.
Can you remember any Christmases when you were a child?
Oh, no, not very good.
Did you have Christmas
Oh, yeah.
presents and trees, or?
The only thing I can remember was we couldn't hardly sleep. We'd get up through the night and see whether Santa Claus had been there yet or not. Folks had a time with us.
What sort of present would you get?
Oh,
Did you get clothes or toys, or?
toys mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Ethel got dolls and stuff.
Did they have trucks for you, or what?
Trucks, you see.
What would you have? Cars or wooden carts, or what did you
I
get?
don't remember too much about the gifts.
Did you get guns ever?
Guns?
Yeah. Did they give you guns for Christmas?
No, they wouldn't allow us to have a gun.
Mm-hmm.
Did you put candy out for Santa Claus?
Yeah, I hoped he'd leave it all for next
Usually, probably he did, huh?
We used to put it out for Santa Claus, didn't we?
And Santa ate it.
You ate a lot of candy then, Dad, when you ate the candy left for Santa Claus.
Well, it's kind of hard to believe it take kids 8 or 10 years old, or back in that time anyhow, we thought there really was Santa Claus.
Yeah. Flo, do you remember anything about the Christmas that you were sick? Marge and Burman and I always remember that. I think that's the one Christmas I remember, because we were up in stairs in bed all together, and Dad was getting after us to be quiet. And he told us, finally came up and said, "Be quiet, I can hear his sleigh over Thurman. And if you're not quiet, he won't come." And we settled down, and he came. And I wondered if you weren't in on that, and I wondered what Christmas was to you then.
I don't remember except you talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't you kind of mad because you thought I would see Santa Claus
Yes,
and you wouldn't?
because you were in the living room.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
a lucky Flo to be sick.
Yeah. And I probably was so out of it, I
Yeah.
wouldn't have known. I think what I remember of it is what I've heard you kids talking about. So. But some of the Christmases I remember is when, I remember we came down into the dining room, and the tree was always usually in that southwest corner. And that one year that the folks had given us those little, what do you call it, mesh purses, or
You did have those.
I wish we still had those, because I think those would be an antique.
Little
They're
antique.
about that long and about that wide and little.
Made of metal?
Yeah,
Metal
well,
mesh?
sort of a metal mesh.
And they had little beads on them.
Yeah, and then they had a little chain handle of some kind. They wouldn't have held very
No,
much.
but a lot of women had evening bags made out of
Yeah,
that sort of thing at that
right.
time.
Then one year we got the little steamer trunks. Did you get a steamer trunk?
I don't
Were
think
you that much younger than Marge and I, but you never got a
so.
steamer
I
trunk?
never got a steamer trunk.
Do you remember the steamer trunks, Dad, that I guess Marge and I got, the little trunks we put our doll clothes in? And had a little tray in them. I think I still have mine, don't I, Mom? Up in the attic?
My dad, I don't know.
And then I used to use it for kind of like a jewelry.
That's such an antique. You ought to bring it downstairs and put it out.
Yeah.
The folks always found time or found the money to somehow or other have Christmas for us, and there would usually be 2 or 3 gifts per person. And I think of the winters in those years, such heavy snows would fall quite frequently, and you'd go to bed in the evening with there being no snow on the ground, and in the morning wake up there had been 11 to 12 inches of snow which fell without any wind, and would be just even the pump handle at the top of the pump would have 10 to 12 inches of snow standing right straight up. And in the winter of 1932, Christmas of 32 I believe, it might have been 31, Sister Florine was so ill, and at the time her life was in the balance whether she would live or not. And I can remember being mostly concerned over the fact that with Florine being in bed down in the living room, that she would get to see Santa Claus and the rest of us wouldn't. But the folks, I remember going to bed that evening, and Marjorie and Phyllis and I were all sleeping in the same bed up in the southeast bedroom in the Baylor house, and it was such a cold night, and the frost was out and the moon, and we would lay in bed and we would just imagine so that we could hear Santa Claus coming. And we even got up and went downstairs early, a time or so, thinking that Santa had been there, but he had not. But in the morning when we got up, why, there was the little red racing car with the headlights which actually operated on. There were 2 batteries in it, and a little wind-up milk cart that was pulled by a gray and white horse, and the girls that year received their little steamer trunks. And then the happy thing was that actually I think Florine passed through the crisis that night, and from then on her recovery was almost uneventful. Let me tell you something which I think is one of the most interesting things that ever happened to me. This was when I was 5 years old, and we lived on the Baylor farm, and I was to be in my first Christmas program in the church, and I was to recite a little story which pertained to Sea of Merry Christmas. And we had been in town on Saturday afternoon before Christmas, and I had seen a brown pair of shoes at the E.C. Axtell General Store, which I thought would be so nice for me to wear to the program, but I did not get them, and I was quite disappointed. But you put those things behind you because that's the way you lived. You just didn't get things, and I don't know how it really happened, but after we got back to the Woodrum farm, and had been there a while, why, an airplane went over, and I've often wondered if an airplane actually went over or the folks just said a plane went over, because airplanes went over so very seldom in those days. But anyway, they said that an airplane was going over, and there was a thud on the porch roof, and Dad was outside and called for me to come out, and there was this package wrapped in brown paper to Burman from Santa Claus. And we opened it up, and there were my brown shoes from the E.C. Axtell store. And if I was truly a believer. I guess I had never doubted there was a Santa Claus, but then I knew there was, and I could still see standing in the church in Bartlett reciting my C, and I could really envision seeing Santa Claus looking through the window.
I can remember probably our first Christmas present we bought Mom and Dad. Each one of us kids had a nickel. So that gave us 10 cents a piece to spend on Mom and Dad for Christmas, and that's the first time we bought them a gift. And we bought Dad a little fountain pen, little pencil pen combination that was about 4 inches long with a fountain pen on one end and a pencil on the other, which we purchased for 10 cents. And we bought Mom 2 small pictures that were probably 3 by 3, and we give a dime for those. That was our first Christmas present for our parents. And that was a joint project of the 4 children.
Another thing we did for entertainment in those days is we would all gather around the dining room table in the evening if Dad was not too tired, and he would read 1 chapter a night, primarily of Nancy Drew adventure stories. And if he were particularly full of energy that evening, and if we 4 had been particularly good and particularly attentive, he would read us 2 chapters. And you can look forward just as much to a reading of a chapter of a story as you can any type of TV program or anything that we had today. And it was always with a good deal of regret when they came to the end of the reading and we had to wait for the next day. So another thing that we did in those times, Sunday school was a big outing for us. The folks would see that we got to go to Sunday school, and then when we got so that they would trust us with a car, why we would drive ourselves. And I think the most interesting thing of those things was when Sister Phyllis had learned to drive and had her license. We went in one Sunday morning, and there was a spinster sister and her married sister that lived on the east side of our town, and we would pick them up and take them to church with us. And they were in the back seat of the car, and Phyllis was driving down the street. And in our little town of Thurman, anything which was different always caused quite a crowd. And on this Sunday, they had some type of trenching machine digging in a water line a block from the church, and all the people had gathered, among them our grandfathers, Charlie Wright. And they were watching this digging, and a man coming down the road was watching the digging and drove down on the wrong side of the street, which happens to be the side that we were on. And Sister Phyllis, knowing that she was in the right, just kept on driving, and we had a head-on collision. And everyone stopped, and Grandpa Wright was quickly on the scene to see that everything was okay. And our car suffered, a little dent in the bumper, maybe the size of a quarter, and the other one had no damage at all because they came exactly together. And Sister Phyllis and I laughed all the way home. Our Miss Flatt and Miss Samuels and Mrs. Flatt, they didn't quite know what to think of the whole thing. Mother and Dad were very disgusted with us when we got home, but we thought we really had done quite well because Phyllis was in the right and didn't yield at all to this oncoming car. See, when the war came, I was 16, and we were at my grandmother and grandfather Wright's when word came over the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and my grandfather made the very profound statement that he was afraid the war would last so long that several members of the family would become involved in it.
The thing I remember, Carl made such a change in his growth in the 6 weeks' time that he went to service. He was in service 6 weeks before I could join him in Salem, Oregon. And he had put on, I would assume, 60 or 70 pounds in the 6 weeks' time, from the lack of hard work that he'd had on the farm to he had hard work in the service, but apparently it was, maybe his diet was different. Exercise, it was uniform somewhere. Anyway, he put on a lot of weight. And he had changed tremendously in the 6 weeks' time when he came in from camp and met me in Salem, Oregon. He just didn't look like because he'd been a thin individual. But we really didn't suffer anything from, Carl had, first he'd come in about once a week, I think. And then it got to where he'd come in every night. But he would be out on their training missions. Maybe they'd be out on for long hikes or things like this. But he wasn't anything serious that I can he didn't have the problem that some had. We were very fortunate because he was with the quartermaster first, and then he was with the hospital thing. So we didn't have some of the, and of course he didn't pass his physical for overseas because of his eye. So he was left in the States. Of course, later on, that type of group did get orders to go overseas, but he didn't. So we weren't affected, too bad that way.
I enlisted in service when I was 17, a rather unusual thing for me. I still don't quite know why I did it, except that I did. And my mother and father were not going to sign my papers because I was a minor, but at the last minute my father did. And on the day that it was time for me to leave, I left on Friday the 13th of August of 1943, and Mother, being a very superstitious person, I'm sure, thought I would probably never come back again. And she didn't quite seem to know how to handle my leaving, but we left, and time passed. We went to, left on the Rock Island Rocket out of Omaha to Denver, and then boarded the Denver Rio Grande Rocky Mountain Rocket. Excuse me, the Denver Rio Grande Exposition Flyer. I went out through Salt Lake City and then into San Francisco, and went to the base at Oakland, California. Han was there through the boot camp, and the highlight of post-boot camp was the fact that the first liberty that we got, his friend of mine from home and myself met Sister Marjorie and brother-in-law Carl at Redding, California. Carl was stationed at a big base in Oregon, and we met up there at Redding.
And then Carl was called into the service. He left October 5th, 1942. And he went to Salem, Oregon, and then 6 weeks later I followed him out there. And then I was there with him about 2.5 years. I lived in Salem. And then after Darrell was born, then we moved to Corvallis to be closer to camp because the camp was closing down. And the big Army buses didn't come into Salem. There was 50,000. You see, the town was 50,000. There's 90,000 men at the base where Carl was at Cappadero, Oregon. So that made a big city out of this smaller town, or a nice little town. But it was a beautiful area to live in, and we lived in this apartment house in Salem, and I walked 14 blocks to work every morning and night. I worked at Woolworth's, and I used to have the horticulture department, and then I moved up to making like Easter novelties, the baskets with the rabbits and the eggs, and I made things like this for them. So probably I reached the great sum of $23 a week when I got to do that. Started out at about 15 and worked up to 18, and then 23 for making the candy novelties. And Carl got $19 a month. I received $50 allotment. We lived on my weekly check, banked the $50 a month allotment, and Carl used his money to go back and forth to camp with. So we didn't spend much. And I would allow myself $1 a week, $5 a week for clothing or something that I wanted special. $5 was allotted for food, and $5 was allotted for rent a week. So our needs weren't too great. I mean, we didn't receive much, but it was ample to go around. And yet, I had a friend whose husband was a sergeant, and he received $97 a month, and they couldn't live on the $97 a month, and her salary, and once in a while she'd want to borrow money from me because they couldn't make their money go around. So I guess we budgeted early in our life.
And then time came to pass that I was assigned aboard a ship, the General House, and while we were waiting for the ship for the construction to finish, while we were all given a few days leave to go home, and which is a thing which I needed to get myself really satisfied with what was going on. And from then on, I really was with the whole service idea. It seemed to fit in very well, and during the next many months while I was aboard this ship and ferrying troops back and forth into the far points of the Pacific. And I was in Eniwetok in the Marshall Gilbert chain the day that the war ended, and we came into San Francisco after all the victory celebrations were over. We made one more trip to the islands, and at that time I was transferred to a district office in Cleveland, Ohio, and I went to Cleveland for the last 6 months of my service. I came back out of service and spent the summer at home, and then enrolled at Iowa State University, where I spent the next 6 years in pursuit of my studies in veterinary medicine.
My birthday was the 6th day of March, so I was my own boss just 3 days. We was married the 9th. Mom, she was 2 months older than I was.
He said he was his own boss for 3 days of his life. Does that mean you took over after you got married?
I guess.
She don't believe it. Oh, we got along, never.
We had good and bad times.
Well, I don't know.
We just put the good and the bad together.
And I see heaven's on its way. It's right here at your door. Me, I will be flying forevermore. Yeah, heaven's on its way. It's right here at your door. And I know you will be flying forevermore.